Then the tracks came up flush to the surface of the roadway down at the next intersection, and then they ran along the surface out to the other end of Long Island to Greenport, 95 miles out. And again, the reason the tunnel is only half a mile long is because that's all it needed to be originally, because Brooklyn was only developed a half mile inland from the waterfront at that time. Now, if you look up through the shaft, you can get an idea of how deep we are. This is the deepest point. We're about 4 stories under the surface of Atlantic Avenue, near Clinton Street. Now, you'll notice the thing is capped off on top by granite slabs. So that's not wood up there, that's stone slabs, actually. Now, you see this chunk of masonry I'm sitting on, and these loose bricks laying on the floor? That's not from the tunnel falling apart. What that actually is from is originally the air shafts went 4 feet above the surface of the roadway to form a parapet wall so people wouldn't fall inside. And when they closed off the tunnel, they broke off the top of the air shaft and threw it in to get rid of it. So that's where this rubble came from. Now, getting back to the linear story of the tunnel, as I mentioned before, because of the local geology, they had to use the cut and cover method, which was developed by the Romans 2,000 years ago. So even though this tunnel was built in Brooklyn, New York in 1844, it was built the exact same way and by the same methods and the same human labor that would have been involved in building a similar tunnel 2,000 years ago in Rome. Now, before I get into more of the detail, let me just explain to you that the geology of the area is what determines what type of construction method is going to be used for building a tunnel. So in this case, it's all just sand and gravel. Why? Well, Brooklyn, which is part of Long Island, is what's called in geological terms a terminal moraine. What that means is that about 14,000 years ago, a glacier came down from the North Pole. And this was no ordinary sheet of ice. It was 5,000 feet high, a mile high, 5 times taller than the Empire State Building. So this ice had a huge amount of weight and force behind it. So as it moved through Canada and moved through New England, it gouged up all the loose soil and boulders ahead of itself and pushed all this dirt as it moved south. So when the ice glacier came to stop at the end of the line in what's now Long Island Sound, all this dirt that had scraped off of Canada and New England was accumulated right ahead of itself. So that's what we're standing on right now. Long Island and Brooklyn is just the scraping debris of Canada and New England. So that's why there was nothing but gravel and sand to dig through on Long Island, and why they had to use the cut and cover method. Now, I just finished telling you how there was no rock in Brooklyn, right? Well, so where did this stone come from? The walls of the stone walls the tunnels are made out of are 6.5 feet thick at the base and 4.5 feet thick at the spring line, which is where the brick arch begins. So where did the stone come from? Well, it came from Manhattan. You see, unlike Brooklyn, Manhattan had mountains on it millions of years ago, and the skyline of these mountains is sort of still there in a certain way, in the form of the present skyline in New York, in Manhattan. Now, where the buildings are really tall and close together in lower Manhattan, the reason they can do that is because those buildings are all resting on top of the base of a worn-away mountain. So there's worn-away mountains holding all those buildings up. Now, where the skyline gets low, from like Soho up to 34th Street, the reason those buildings are not tall is because there's no rock close by. So that's what a valley was originally. Then there was a second mountain that ran from 34th Street, where the Empire State Building is, up to Central Park. That's the second mountain, and that's why they were able to have all those tall buildings in Midtown going up through Central Park. And then there was another valley that went through Harlem. In fact, under 145th Street, there's actually a geological fault line, just like the ones they have in San Francisco, except our fault lines don't move around very much because they don't jam up. The way you get big earthquakes is that the tectonic plates jam up on each other and they hold pressure for a couple of hundred years, and then the rock fails and you get a big landslide, you get a big earthquake. But in Manhattan, it's different. Our fault line has plates that are moving around very slightly all the time. So there's always earthquakes in this area, but they're so small you don't feel them. So hopefully we won't get a big one. You know, they say that the big ones are going to be in other places where the plates are jammed together tight. So ours moves around a lot, so it's less likely it'll blow up as a big earthquake. Now, the contractor who built this tunnel, William Beard, had experience with building cut-and-covered aqueduct tunnels because 2 years earlier he built the Croton Aqueduct, which brought water into Manhattan from Westchester County. And a lot of that aqueduct was cut-and-cover work. And the way they got the design for this tunnel was kind of interesting. The guy who was the engineer in charge of the Croton Aqueduct originally was an unknown guy who was really a sort of a genius type, but he was a little bit eccentric, so he never got credit for what he built because he never stayed around long enough for to see it actually get constructed. He would design the stuff and get bored and then go off to something else before it ever got built. His name was David Bates Douglas. And he's the first designer of the Croton Aqueduct and the High Bridge over the Harlem River. Now, what he did with that aqueduct is interesting. At that time, the only kind of civil engineering they had available to them was Roman engineering techniques. And that's what they taught at West Point, which was the only engineering school in the country back in those days. They taught Roman civil engineering. What they basically did to get the Croton Aqueduct is they copied the Emperor Claudius's waterworks from 2,000 years ago. Now, the way they got the design for this tunnel right here is they took the design from the Croton Aqueduct, which was in turn based upon the Emperor Claudius's waterworks, and they took the tunnel and multiplied the water tunnel, and they multiplied the dimensions by 2.6. And that gave you a tunnel that was high enough and wide enough for 2 railroad trains to pass each other side by side. So that's where the design for this tunnel came from. The world's first subway tunnel was based on an aqueduct tunnel, which in turn was based on a Roman aqueduct that was 2,000 years old. So that's how it was calculated. Now, the roof of the tunnel has about 8 million bricks in it by calculation. And they were probably made in the area around Haverstraw, New York. That's a big brick manufacturing area from that time period. And they were probably moved by barge down the Hudson River into Brooklyn. Now, you might wonder, how do you get 8 million bricks to defy gravity and hang in space while the cement in their joints dries up? And the answer is you don't. That's where the trick comes in. This type of an arch is called a barrel vault roof, and it gets its name from the wooden form that's used for putting it up. Basically, what they did to build the tunnel was the following. First, they had a crew of sandhogs who got paid 13 cents a day to dig out the trench. And in this case, the trench is 33 feet wide. That's the outside dimension of the tunnel, accounting for the thickness of the walls. And then in this particular spot, it was 40 feet deep. And so they dug it out and made the trench. Then they brought the stone in from Manhattan, because at the same time William Beard, the contractor, was building this place, he had jobs to build parts of Broadway and 3rd Avenue. So around where the UN building is today and around Harlem, he found lots of natural rock outcroppings. So he cut the stuff up using an effective but primitive method of hand-cutting stone called wedges and shims. And he then brought the rock over on barges and fed it in. So first you had the trench that was dug out. Then you put the walls in. Then you put in railroad tracks. On top of the railroad tracks come a couple of railroad flat cars bolted together side by side. And on top of the flat cars is the barrel vault form. It's a wooden form 50 feet in length and made the exact size and shape of the inside of the roof of this tunnel. And it's made out of planks like a foot thick that could hold up the dead weight of all these bricks laying on top while the cement hardens up in the brick joints. So using screw jacks, which were the only kind of machines they had back then, besides pulleys and crowbars, they lifted up this wooden form and laid the brick on it from one wall across to the other wall. And then they went back and forth and built up the thickness of the roof they were looking for until the arch was 4.5 feet thick where it meets the stone and 2 feet thick at the center, which is called the crown. So then they let the cement in the joints harden up for a few hours, and they would lower down the wooden form using the screw jacks and move the railroad cars up 50 feet with this wooden form and lift it up again and repeat the process. So even though the tunnel has a homogeneous brick roof that's a continuous sheet of brick half a mile long, it was actually made in 50-foot long ring segments. But the ring segments are fit together so well like Lego blocks, you can't tell where one ring ends and the next ring begins. So that's how it was constructed. Now, keeping in mind again that there were no machines back in those days, the entire tunnel, half a mile long, took 7 months to build. So how did they do that? Well, they had a crew of 700 to 800 Irishmen doing the construction work. Now, the tunnel was originally designed to be one track and only 14 feet wide. So the city of Brooklyn gave the railroad only 4 months to build this place. Now they changed the design one day to 2 tracks wide and 21 feet wide. So they still had the same length of time to build a 2-track tunnel as they were originally given to build a 1-track tunnel. So when they got down to about where we are now, they ran out of time. So the railroad got all upset, and they went and hired an overseer to come down and make the men work faster. Now, back in those days, an overseer was kind of like a cross between a construction foreman and a slave driver. So the overseer they hired was English, so he gathered up the 800 Irishmen to tell them that now they have to work on Sundays because they made the project bog down because of their laziness. It wasn't their laziness, it's because they changed the design of the tunnel right in the middle of it.